secrecy with either the most toxic material on Earth, plutonium, or one of the most toxic.
Rocky Flats in its present condition and over the last decade has been extremely dangerous.
Rockwell feels confident that we have been complying with all applicable state and federal laws.
Shut down Rocky Flats! Shut down Rocky Flats!
You need to have facts to justify the closure of that plant.
They should have made it impossible for residential areas to get so close to it.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ernie Bjorkman. We're calling tonight's program critical mass. It's the scientific term for the amount of material needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. A scary term. Indeed, a scary thought, one most of us would just as soon not think about. But once again, we are confronted with the reality of living next to a nuclear weapons plant. The FBI raid 2 weeks ago on Rocky Flats reminds us that we are neighbors with a plant where they make triggers for bombs. And in fact, the triggers themselves are small atomic bombs. The seed came from the earth, pale green rock which held incredible power. Conceived during the Second World War, America's nuclear industry was born into a world of real and imagined threat. Adopted during the Cold War, the atom's new guardians spewed venom. Some of the parents had become unfit, worse, un-American.
You agreed to give us the names of those responsible in the case of this Fifth Amendment communist, and that they would be called before the committee.
Carefully nurtured by warriors and politicians, the atom has grown to be respected by governments, feared by mankind. We no longer control the child, it controls us. We are not talking about peaceful uses of atomic energy here. We're talking about bombs and secrecy. 40 years ago, the Atomic Energy Commission set about the work of making bombs. The assembly line stretched across this country. Design at Los Alamos or near Berkeley, California. Non-nuclear components built in Albuquerque. Detonators from Dayton, Ohio. Neutron generators from Florida. The bombs assembled near Amarillo, Texas. The AEC decided the plutonium triggers should be manufactured near the source of the uranium, the Colorado Plateau. 6 potential sites were reviewed. Guidelines included isolation and distance within the plant and away from civilization. It should be located at least 20 miles from any town with 1,000 or more citizens, 20 miles from the nearest highway or railroad. The guidelines were scrapped in favor of a site called Rocky Flats, Colorado. Rocky Flats was selected in 1951 amid promise of economic well-being. Colorado's citizens were not told what the plant would be manufacturing, nor would they likely have cared if they knew. When the plant opened in 1953, Denver had only begun to grow. Fewer than 20,000 people lived in nearby Boulder, and Golden, to the south, had just over 5,000 residents. Arvada was half Golden size, and Thornton, North Glen, Westminster, Lakewood, Wheat Ridge, Broomfield, and Louisville were not yet even cities. Much has changed. A series of accidents and incidents at Rocky Flats has opened some of the secret doors. More is known about the plant, its product, and its waste. The world has a better understanding of the danger. There is more to fear than just the bomb. And those fears have been renewed with the events of the past 2 weeks. The investigation of Rocky Flats has revealed, or perhaps just reminded us, of serious health and safety concerns. We are confronted with allegations of contaminated air and water. Charges fly that the very government that is supposed to protect us may have been lying to us. During the next 55 minutes, we'll be looking deeper into these allegations and into the potential for an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction in our own backyard. We'll talk to the politicians from the governor's mansion, Governor Roy Romer. We'll also be talking to a biochemist, Neil Schoenbeck, who works at NCAR in Boulder. And we'll be talking to the man who blew the whistle on Rocky Flats, James Stone, who was the plant's troubleshooting engineer. Also joining me here in the studio is reporter Dave Mitchell, who has covered Rocky Flats for a decade now. David?
Ernie, we should mention some people who are not represented here tonight. We've invited them to be on the program. They are not. That's the Department of Energy, which oversees the plant. They told us they'd like to be here, but logistics prevented that. And Rockwell International, the private contractor that manages the operation. They told us their attorneys ordered them not to appear because of the ongoing FBI investigation. Ernie?
Okay, David, thank you very much. We'll be back in a minute with more on Rocky Flats. Rocky Flats has had to travel a rocky road before, but never like this. Dave Mitchell is covering that story. And Dave, it seems like literally that plant out there is under siege for the past 2 weeks.
That's exactly what it is, Ernie. It is under siege. Of course, there have been investigations before when there were fires or spills or even a death at the plant. But there's never been anything like this. The Government Accounting Office investigating inflated contractor bonuses. The State Health Department probing dangerous storage, handling, and dumping of hazardous waste. And, of course, 100 federal agents who are at the plant right now. An unprecedented probe. The Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. Denver in the background. Seen through a night scope. Only the plant's lights and the light of the moon providing illumination. This is the site an FBI spy plane saw last December. And what that spy plane uncovered triggered an unprecedented federal investigation.
This search warrant has been issued in connection with a criminal investigation into possible violations of this nation's environmental laws.
The FBI's heat-sensing cameras found a stack in the main plutonium processing building hot, allegedly from burning radioactive and chemical waste, even though the government had ordered Building 771 shut down a month earlier for safety reasons. That's why 75 FBI agents and dozens of EPA experts stormed the plant, sampling Flats poisons, seizing records, interrogating employees and executives.
The search warrant calls for a search of the Rocky Flats facility, and that would include anything from records to outside areas, to pools, to buildings, to what's contained in the buildings.
Each new sunrise brought new allegations, not just pollution of the air in the dead of night, but midnight dumping of toxins into streams that provide drinking water, and a web of lies aimed at covering up years of poisoning.
It jars one to the bone to realize that the judgments that we have made in Colorado may have been made on bad information, and that information was tampered with in some way that involved a criminal act.
Plant operator Rockwell denies any intentional contamination or lies.
Rockwell feels confident that we have been complying with all applicable state and federal laws and will continue to do so.
But business as usual at the Flats is risky business, according to the former plant engineer who blew the whistle 2 years ago and started the FBI investigation.
We damn sure should be afraid of it. And those people that are working there know that. And I asked them to come forth and testify as to what they know.
Stone told terrifying tales of plutonium glove boxes that leak, safety equipment that doesn't work, and a plant unaccountable to the public. Worst of all, Stone told of conditions that might trigger criticality, a tiny nuclear chain reaction, which could have spread radioactive debris downwind, downtown, across the city. Did the conditions ever exist for criticality?
I believe they did regularly. I think they still do.
Under enormous public and political pressure, the Department of Energy Friday shut down the incinerator that feeds this stack. That incinerator is the most likely source of an accidental chain reaction. And the governor signed an unprecedented agreement, giving the state access and funding to check the plant firsthand. But much of what's gone on at the plant and its effects on us are still big questions.
Is it safe? Is the air safe? Is the water safe? Is there pollution of any kind that will endanger my health? That's the question everybody wants to know when they turn on the television.
Governor Roy Romer joins us now live from the Capitol. The governor for the past couple of hours has been with a group of doctors representing the Colorado and Denver medical societies, and they are asking exactly the same kinds of questions that the governor was asking in that last sound you saw. Governor, tell us about that meeting tonight. What did they say? What did you say?
Well, we came out in agreement. They had not had an opportunity to go through that agreement that I had signed on Friday. Once they did, they said, hey, that makes sense. That provides the verification, independent verification that we want. We agree with the agreement, therefore we got together. There is not a disagreement between the medical society and what we're doing. They endorsed what I'm doing. I said, I need your help. I want your help. Just let me say, Dave, that that's a serious problem. We need to be sure that we protect the safety and the citizens of this state and the workers. And we're going to do that. We're going to put in place the monitoring independently verified so that we don't need to rely upon somebody's statement that works for DOE or Rockwell. We're going to have an independent verification of safety.
Governor, when we spoke Sunday, you just talked to the doctors, and they issued a news release which said flatly, we think that the plutonium production at Rocky Flats should stop. When you met with them tonight, have they backed away from that position?
Yes, they said that what they wanted to do was to be sure that there was adequate monitoring going to be in place. They said, we've now studied the agreement you drew, you got them to agree to. We say that's the right course, so they backed away from that. We're going down the same path tonight.
Okay, Governor Romer, thank you. We'll be talking to you in just a minute, but first I'd like to introduce Representative Pat Schroeder. She's coming to us live from Chicago, where she's just taped a firing line up there in Chicago. Ms. Schroeder, thank you for joining us tonight. Now that the dust has settled somewhat and we have a, quote, agreement with the federal government, the DOE, what's your feelings now?
Well, we're going to be very cautious. Look, DOE keeps wanting to say we're just going to sweep the whole past behind us and now we have a new life. Let's hope that's true, but we want to make sure that that's true because we've heard that story before and their credibility is at the end as far as I'm concerned. So we're going to be monitoring that carefully. Today I sent a letter as Dean of the Colorado delegation to both DOE and the Department of Justice saying to Admiral Watkins and to Thornburg, we want both of them over briefing the whole delegation the minute they get their final report from this whole survey that's going on in this whole investigation. When that happens, I think then we put all the pieces together and make an assessment as to whether we move further or not.
For all the residents living in this area, how can you assure them that it's going to be better this time than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that veil of secrecy will have been taken off?
Well, first of all, I'm going to tell them that next week when we mark up the Armed Services Committee bill, which has jurisdiction over this, I'm going to ask for the right to offer an amendment on the House floor when we get to the House floor, saying that the plant will have to be closed down unless DOE follows the terms of the agreement that they put in there. And we'll put it right in the bill. So they don't get the money to operate the plant unless they follow through on the agreements that they've made. No more trust. We want it in writing, we want it verifiable, and we're going to monitor it every minute.
Let me ask Governor Romer a question. Governor, the congressperson says no more trust. You are putting a lot of trust in an organization that historically has not come through on the promises they've made to you. How come you ought to believe them this time? How come we ought to believe them this time?
You mean the Department of Energy?
Yes.
You know, we're putting in place an independently verifiable monitoring system. I said we don't need to have the assurances of DOE to test whether or not there's the safety of the water or the air of Colorado citizens. I'm going to have in place a monitoring system that we can independently verify, and that's what I mean by that. Now look, one other thing about this business on trust. We've got to get back to the place where we can trust federal officials. If we can't trust federal officials, we got to change them, and we got to get some others. We cannot run this government, state or federal, unless in the long run you trust it. And let me make a very concrete suggestion to the federal government. They ought to release the results of that infrared photography within a week. They ought to release it because that is one of the most serious charges, and I don't want to wait 6 months or 12 months for a grand jury. I want to know, what does that photograph show, and is it independently verified or not? Because we need to know, was there midnight burning or was there not? And I don't think that one ought to lay unanswered by 6 or 12 months. And I would say to the Department of Justice and to the President of the United States. You owe it to the people of Colorado to put that evidence out right now, because we have a real problem of confidence in this state. We ought to close that gap as soon as possible.
Ms. Schroeder, let me ask you this question. Since this has happened, since the FBI raid, a lot of people have jumped on a bandwagon. Some people are saying, where were our politicians, our political leaders years ago, a year ago, 5 years ago? Why didn't we clamor for this to happen a long time ago?
I have been. I thought it was outrageous that time after time one of the agreements was always to allow DOE to go investigate itself, and I always voted against that. But we'd have many people who got on board. And of course DOE came in and said, we've got a clean bill of health. Now I don't think that's DOE so much as it is human nature. Who's going to go out and say, oh, that's right, what we did was really not level with you. But giving money to DOE to investigate itself was an absolute outrage. I've always voted against the Price-Anderson Act, which gave them the idea that they were totally free from any of this. But I think people have been very frightened because DOE has almost questioned your patriotism, questioned everything if you question them. And they did it from a real arrogance of power attitude. And so I think a lot of people thought, well, if they're so arrogant about it, they certainly must be right. And I think people also find it very hard to think that they played so fast and loose with people's health. I'm really shocked that they went as far as they did.
Okay, Ms. Schroeder, thank you very much. And Governor Romer, we'll be back with you in just a minute. This is not the first time there has been trouble at Rocky Flats. The plant's 36-year history is a patchwork of near disasters. According to the book Deadly Defense, there have been more than 200 fires at the plant since its startup.
In 1957, a powerful explosion in a plutonium building causes a major fire, releasing an unknown amount of plutonium into the atmosphere. This is the first admission that the plant deals in plutonium, the primary ingredient in the small atomic bombs, the triggers, used to detonate hydrogen bombs. 1962, pre-filters are installed backwards in Building 771, releasing an unknown amount of plutonium. The pre-filters are destroyed by fire 3 times by the end of the year. A chemical explosion in a glove box in 1964 releases a small amount of plutonium, as does a glove box fire in 1965. In 1969, a plutonium fire caused $45 million damage, the largest industrial fire in U.S. history. Plant officials downplay the incident, but in a closed congressional hearing later, officials call the '69 fire a near catastrophe for the Denver area. Another investigation reveals that for 10 years, several thousand drums of plutonium-tainted oil have been stored on land surrounding the plant, and that some of those drums have leaked radioactive fluids. The drums are removed and the contaminated area is covered with asphalt. In 1971, there is another barrel leak and 2 more explosions. The following year, another glove box explosion and incinerator fire. In 1974, a valve failure releases plutonium. 2 years ago, 3 fires during testing of a proposed incinerator for radioactive waste. Rockwell postpones the idea indefinitely. And just last week, the State Health Department hits the plant with more than 24 new violations concerning hazardous waste storage, handling, and dumping.
And we'll be right back with a look at what they produce out at Rocky Flats and its important role in our national defense.
Rocky Flats is the cornerstone among coast-to-coast building blocks that make up the U.S. nuclear arms factory. Its indispensable role was emphasized, ironically, by the shutdown for safety reasons of nuclear facilities elsewhere in the country. The product here is the so-called plutonium trigger, actually a bomb within a bomb. Weighing about 10 pounds, it fits into one end of the hydrogen bomb. When exploded, it creates temperatures and pressures like those inside the sun. The force triggers the hydrogen components and the thermonuclear blast capable of destroying whole cities. The plutonium trigger is the heart of every hydrogen bomb. bombs that make up 90% of the estimated 26,000 nuclear warheads in the U.S. arsenal. That's nearly half of the world's supply, nearly all the other half belonging to the Soviet Union. It's that 50-50 balance of terror, nuclear strategists say, that assures peace by assuring destruction of all countries involved in a nuclear war. Without Rocky Flats, without the triggers, that balance might be lost, and so the reluctance to shut it down under any circumstances. Consider some numbers and you'll understand the danger at Rocky Flats. The 4-pound buttons of plutonium routinely handled by workers contain enough radioactivity to give cancer to half the human race if divided evenly and inhaled. One plutonium trigger contains more than twice that amount. Best estimates by defense research groups show that Rocky Flats produces between 700 and 1,000 triggers a year, twice that many in some years. The role of Rocky Flats is ever more critical because of the need to supply its own plutonium by recycling materials in nuclear bombs, a process requiring waste incineration in the plant's Building 771. Recycling has been stepped up in recent years because plutonium-producing nuclear reactors at Hanford, Washington, and Savannah River, South Carolina, have been shut down due to their own threats to safety. The triggers made here must be replaced about every 5 years. The demand of the bomb makers is insatiable. Rocky Flats is indispensable, at least for now.
And a man who certainly knows a lot about what goes on inside Rocky Flats is Mr. James Stone.
He was the plant's troubleshooting engineer for 6 years before he was fired. Fired, he claims, for blowing the whistle. He's filed a suit against Rocky Flats. He's lost part of that, but he's appealing it. Along with that suit, he went to the FBI 2 years ago with serious allegations that started this probe. He joins us now live. Jim, thank you again for joining us. Probably the allegation you have made that has gotten the greatest attention, is that conditions existed at Rocky Flats for criticality, for a small nuclear chain reaction. Tell us about that.
Well, that's true, and criticality really starts with the manifest. You have to know what you're handling before you can take the proper precautions to prevent serious criticality. Now, criticality is generally in 3 stages. The subcritical, where nothing much is happening, to the controlled critical, like you have in a power plant. It's the supercritical that we don't want to happen. So our job really is to keep everything subcritical at Rocky Flats. That takes close attention to the material you're handling. That has to be manifest properly. It has to be configured properly. The shape of it has to be proper. The density has to be proper. The spacing has to be proper. There's a half a dozen factors that we're taught out there that have to be controlled in order to keep this thing subcritical.
Mr. Stone, did they practice those safety practices closely enough at Rocky Flats during your 6 years there?
I don't believe they did as thoroughly as they could. When I've watched some of the activities go on, some of the damnedest foolish things you can imagine, like that concrete fiasco, it's just hard to believe that they were very conscientious about any stage of this operation.
Mr. Stone, let us interrupt for a minute. Since you were talking about criticality, and it is an issue that is very much on the minds of people this day, we have a special report on that very subject. Technologically, it's very hard to make an H-bomb work, but in principle, it's just simple physics. It means getting enough radioactive material in one place at one time in the right shape. When that happens, that's called critical mass. A chain reaction starts, atoms split, tremendous amounts of energy are released. At Rocky Flats, that radioactive material is plutonium, named after Pluto, the god of hell. At the flats, it's formed into pits.
Without the components from the other production facilities, the pit alone is not capable of a nuclear explosion.
If there was a nuclear criticality incident, as they call it at the flats, the plant says it wouldn't be anything like a nuclear bomb blast.
It would be very, very difficult to get a big explosion like a bomb, but you can have sort of minor accidents where people at Los Alamos recorded blue flashes. A guy next to it, standing next to it, got a lethal dose of neutrons and died a couple weeks later.
A critical mass can occur in plutonium scrap machined at the plant, or in glove boxes, even in collections of plutonium dust from machining. Rocky Flats insists there's never been a criticality incident at the plant, not even a blue flash. But we've learned there have been 30 criticality alarms a year for the past 10 years when conditions in the glove box approach a critical mass.
We have had incidents in past years in which, had they not been checked or corrected, could possibly have resulted in a criticality.
A close call, is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't say it was a close call. I would say that it is an incident that was found before it happened.
There are new questions about criticality today. We've learned the safety system designed to warn of criticality has a history of failures. Jim Stone, let me ask you, during your experience at Rocky Flats, did you ever hear of any of these blue flashes, these tiny but potentially destructive critical mass nuclear chain reactions?
I remember seeing a note recently from a health physicist that said he suspected room 127 in building 881. Now, 881 is outside the normal secured perimeter. A so-called clean building. But that room could go critical. I've seen enough carelessness at that plant that, and I've also studied the manual carefully enough to know that when that manual says only you can stop criticality, and I see the carelessness going on all the time, I say it's time we stop relying on human frailties and go to complete automations and double and triple checking
Jim
on
Stone,
what we're doing.
Okay,
we'll
Jim.
be back to you in just a minute.
Yeah, right now I'd like to introduce from Boulder Dr. Neil Schoenbeck, a biochemist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He's on a governor's panel who has been monitoring Rocky Flats, I think, for the past year and a half. And Doctor, first of all, let me ask you, the things you've been hearing, criticality, things like that, what's your impressions about all the news over the past 2 weeks?
Well, criticality is important, but I think it misses the point that the major contamination in Rocky Flats is plutonium. But if you want to talk about criticality, it has to do with whether Rocky Flats is telling the truth or not. We don't know really the information about strontium-90 or cesium-137. We would like to see the data to verify this. I would say that Rocky Flats is correct when it says that it's very difficult to get an explosion out there. What we're worried about is a chain reaction which gives off tremendous amounts of radiation and also radioactive debris.
From the allegations that we've heard over the past 2 weeks, should people living around Rocky Flats and even farther downwind in the Metro Denver area be worried about the allegations?
Well, it depends upon in the future. You know, I don't think they need to be afraid of the allegations from criticalities in the past. There doesn't seem to be information that I've seen that would make it a major health hazard. The issue is the credibility of Rocky Flats and the information we're getting. I'm concerned about the position of Rocky Flats so close to Denver and a possible future catastrophe. So the past experience with Rocky Flats is important to me to assess what might happen in the future. To dismiss future catastrophes on the based on past occurrences and without enough data, to me, is not the right way to go.
Mr. Schoenbeck, in our report, we made a brief reference to criticality alarms that didn't work. We reported earlier today that there were 143 instances where the criticality alarms that are supposed to warn the Department of Energy and Rockwell if something is going wrong in the glove boxes didn't work. You're on the monitoring council. You are supposed to receive information on what happens out of the ordinary at Rocky Flats. They tell you anything about this?
No, we've had no information on criticality or near criticality incidences.
Or alarm failure?
No.
How candid are they with you? Do they tell you what you need to know what's going on up there?
Well, I don't feel that we get all the information. Part of it is that we don't know exactly what to ask for because the whole operation is shrouded in secrecy. 40 years of habitual secrecy makes it very difficult to know what the right questions to ask. They will not give any information, in my experience, unless directly asked for. Now, they do give monitoring data, for example, which is a very good step in the right direction. But we need to look for more detailed monitoring. For example, in the monthly monitoring reports, we are given averages. What we would like to see are the maximum and the minimum, so that we get a sense of unusual emissions rather than just an average in a month.
Let me go back to Governor Romer and ask him with this agreement, will we get some of the things that Dr. Schoenbeck is talking about?
Yes. You know, just let me say that there's a new era of regulation and access after last Friday.
A new wind is blowing, as you said.
In this agreement, they agreed to give us, state of Colorado, access to that incinerator on its daily log. We're going to know everything that goes in that incinerator. They agreed to give us access during its operation. We absolutely are going to have more access to that plant to monitor what we're responsible for. Now, we're not responsible for the question of criticality. Let me say to you who are on this program and to everybody who is listening, we absolutely want to find a way to assure the citizens of the state that this is a safe operation and that it is a clean operation. And I think that it is imperative that we be very careful about the kind of charges on criticality. I spoke with the Department of Energy officials last week and I said, I want an independent verification on the question of criticality. They said they would give it to us. And I'm going to be working with the components of that independent panel. And I just want to say to all the citizens of this state, over a period of time, we're going to assure, for one way or the other, that your lives are not in danger. Or I think that plant needs to close.
Now, if you find that there was an instance of criticality or close to it, will you tell the public?
Hey, look, you know, I will obviously make known any information that I receive. But the problem here is the words that are being used. Let me talk to you about criticality. It's like you had 4 valves before you got some fluid out of a tank. And you got 4 valves. They're all redundant. One is to check the other, the other, the other. It may be defined as a criticality when the first valve doesn't operate, but you got 3 other valves to check you. Now, we need to be very careful about the damaging inferences that are coming from this conversation. As I sit here, I do not know. I do not know. But I tell you, I'm going to do my very best to find out. But I do not want us to arrive at a state of panic in this state based on allegations that are not yet proven. And let me come again back to that question of the infrared night photograph about midnight burning. I think that ought to be laid on the table within a matter of days and tell us whether it's true or whether it's not true, or tell us what they know.
Okay.
I don't think they ought to leave us hanging out.
All right, Jim Stone.
I don't see any reason why we shouldn't know the full extent of that process out there. We know exactly the criteria that it takes to make a criticality, and we know the exact counter criteria that it takes to avoid a criticality. Now, if we knew every step of that process and could measure that criteria against that process, we would know what would work and what would fail.
Governor Romer, I could see that you are not particularly happy with what is being said here. I gather that what you are trying to tell us is that criticality in your mind is not a question that should consume us. Indeed, we may be alarming people unnecessarily.
You know, let me reply to that. I'm not happy about this dialogue, and I'll tell you why. You know, Mr. Stone has a point of view. I take it seriously. But I know he has been in litigation with Rockwell and the Department of Energy for a number of years. He is very discontented with the way he was treated out there, and I know that. And I don't know how credible his evidence is. I take it very seriously. But I want you, all of you who are putting this program on, to know that you're dealing with a very important subject. And I want us to deal very carefully with it. And I don't want us to alarm the citizens of this Denver area that there's going to be an atomic chain reaction out there overnight. I think that you've raised the subject. We need to get the very best experts in this country out here to help us answer it because you've raised it. But I am not happy, quite frankly, by this narrow perspective and charge that has been given. And I think we need to get an independent verification of it and get it very soon.
And that's what you're doing, as I understand it.
That's correct.
Dr. Schoenbeck?
Am I on?
Go ahead.
What I wanted to say was that I'm with Governor Romer on wanting to get independent verification. I think he did an excellent job in getting a principal agreement signed with DOE. I've read that agreement, and to me it seems that there are some loopholes. And what I would strongly suggest is that we find some advisory council of scientists who are familiar with the processes that are not part of DOE, not part of Rockwell, who can advise the governor to ask the proper questions, because there's always, without data and without firsthand knowledge of these processes, there are things that can be left unasked and we can't verify. If in order to see everything at Rocky Flats, for example, you have to have a Q clearance. Inspectors coming in do not necessarily have them. And at the moment, as I understand, Rocky Flats can refuse an immediate inspection. And so you still have that question. And I think we ought to pursue that.
Okay, Pat Schroeder in Chicago. Last week you said people like Jim Stone were heroes, whistleblowers who brought this to everybody's attention. It seems like Governor Romer may not think the same way you do. What's your thinking about Jim Stone, the criticality issue, and things like that?
Oh, I think that maybe you're putting words in Governor Romer's mouth. I'm sure Governor Romer salutes the independent judgment and the very difficult decision Mr. Stone had to make to bring all this up. It really does take an incredible amount of courage. Look, the bottom line is we've got to have Q-class clearances for everybody that works for the state that's going to do the inspections and for the people that we trust from the outside that aren't DOE people. No more trust for DOE. And I think that's what the governor wants, it's what Mr. Stone wants, and it's certainly what I want. And there's absolutely no reason why they can't get us Q-class clearances, and there's no reason that they should be allowed to say, oh no, these are all secret, we can't know. Then we'll start to get to the bottom of it. And we don't need somebody to come out and tell us the whole process. No one really, we just want to know that someone who doesn't work for DOE, who understands what this is about, has gone in and been able to look at it any time of the day or night from beginning to end and make some kind of an evaluation. That's it. And until we get that, we're not going to have trust restored. I think the governor has started this process, and I think we've got to get this process nailed down as tightly as possible and say to DOE, this is the only thing that's acceptable, nothing more.
Governor Romer?
Pat Schroeder's right on point. Pat, today I asked for my Q clearance. I want you to know. I thought I needed to have one because I need to talk to people who will be inspecting for me who will have Q clearances. On Dr. Schoenbeck, I think he's exactly right. I've already started, Doctor, the process to get an independent panel to advise me. A panel which is not state employees or federal employees, but independent scientists who can tell me whether or not the monitoring process that we're going to put in place is adequate and whether or not it gives us the right kind of information.
Okay, Governor Romer, thank you very much. Jim Stone, you're kind of in the middle of this. Do you have anything to say?
Yes, I'd like when Roy gets his clearance to go out and have that furnace door opened and take a reading in there. If they haven't sandblasted it clean, it ought to be radioactive.
Jim Stone, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. We'll be back with you right after this. First of all, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to talk about our public safety concerning all of us here in the Metro Denver area. Some of the possible dangers posed by Rocky Flats are immediate, like the fires. Others can take years to develop. For instance, there is evidence that plutonium contamination in the body shows up maybe 20 years after exposure. Cynthia Hessen looks at the environmental, health, and safety concerns surrounding the Rocky Flats operation.
That thing should never have been built here, and it is a constant daily threat to this community.
Even the Department of Energy decided recently that it was time to begin thinking about relocating its only plutonium trigger facility. With a population base which has grown out to meet Rocky Flats over 36 years, wind patterns off the mountains and across the high plain which were originally miscalculated, and some water characteristics in the area which tend to encourage contamination spread, the plant is not an ideal city industry. The voices speaking out against the plant have been growing in intensity for 20 years. Dr. Harvey Nichols is a biologist at CU. His work tracking pollen migration brought an invitation from Rocky Flats in 1975 to study whether pollens may be carrying tiny radioactive particles away from the plant, borne along in the airflows, which are different by day or night in that area. Nichols also sampled fresh snow.
A place on Indiana Street, which is 3 miles from the plant approximately, there was such a high level of tiny radioactive particles that it was just the same as the levels at the plant. And this suggested that somehow gravity was not settling out these particles.
Nichols' research was no longer funded after those initial results, even though in the reports he submitted to Rocky Flats, then Governor Dick Lamb, and Congressman Tim Wirth, he said there was a clear implication for follow-up. His work was never acknowledged, but never formally disputed, even when he reintroduced it to state officials last year.
Since we're all breathing in and out like little vacuum cleaners, this presumably is what's happening to some of this dust. Since it isn't settling out readily due to gravity, it's actually impinging on some people's lungs, and it's just a sort of Russian roulette.
At one time, between 1979 and 81, a map of possible movement of plutonium particles was a standard warning if you were buying a house in the area. The map was discontinued by Reagan administration housing officials. What plutonium can do when the most microscopic particles are inhaled is lodge in lung tissue and begin changing cells into tumors. Then, if it enters the bloodstream, it can bring about other adverse effects, especially in reproductive functions. Although it is a known fact that large doses of radiation cause cancer, it is apparently difficult to prove an individual case against a plutonium particle. There have been some unusual incidents of cancer reported over the years: brain cancer in Rocky Flats workers, other types in nearby residents. 10 years ago, Jefferson County Health Director Carl Johnson developed pioneering data which showed how he believed cancer rates were elevated the closer you lived to the plant. Last week, Dr. Johnson's family accepted 2 awards for his work, which was discounted by many officials until after his death.
We do not believe that there is enough evidence to conclude that there are increased cancer rates.
We don't think everybody that has an idea about something wrong at the facility is crazy. We give careful consideration to most of those kinds of pieces of input that we get.
The state and local agencies have paid more attention to the water on and near Rocky Flats. The concern here is hundreds of industrial chemicals, solvents, and reagents which are used in processing plutonium or performing other plant functions. There is frequent testing of surface water because of the adjacent reservoirs which serve several municipalities in the area. But 2 independent water and environmental consultants we talked with say surface water is only a part of the trail. Below the water is sediment, and below that several layers of groundwater, all of which can attract, hold, and redistribute toxins.
Unless you take account of the fact that you could get adsorption onto the sediment, you might misread contamination levels quite severely.
Mike Harvey and Dave Stewart looked at some of the Rocky Flats annual reports last week. Based on a preliminary assessment, they say what appears to be missing is some indication of the contaminant pathways. They were also surprised at the high levels of some things recorded.
Certainly, those high concentrations are something that I would consider fairly high values or very high values, and something that you would want to look at putting in some kind of barrier system to stop it.
The news of the past 2 weeks has caused several governments and citizens to demand more knowledge and more action. And some are urging that we not look exclusively to the government for answers.
There are an awful lot of people who have the ability to evaluate the studies for themselves and to draw some conclusions where they really don't have to rely on so-called experts to interpret them for them.
Let's go back to NCAR and Boulder to Dr. Schoenbeck. What's out there that we ought to be worried about, and are we ever going to be able to clean it up?
Well, that's a question that we're trying to answer now, and in part Governor Romer's principal agreement makes some provisions for health studies. If you want to find out whether plutonium is bad for you, what you need to do is study the people closest to it, which are the workers at Rocky Flats itself. And that has been done in part. And the result of that study that came out in =87 is that there seems to be some cancers that show up in the lymph system and the blood system at fairly low plutonium levels in the body, virtually at the detection limit. Now, if you want to study people in the Denver area, it's a very, very difficult question. And it's probably going to cost us an excess of $2 million to mount that study. In the first year, there has been, at least in the agreement, DOE has promised us $700,000 to begin a toxicological review, which is the first step. The next thing that we have to do is then decide in some way how much plutonium has been distributed over Denver, which is called a dosed reconstruction. This would happen in the next 2 or 3 years, that we could get that data together if we had the money and the personnel to support that. Now that's something that both scientists and the people want. Now whether we're going to get answers out of that is something we can't promise now. If you really want to know whether plutonium is harmful and at what levels, we should look at the workers as well as the citizens in Denver.
Governor Romer?
Well, that, and Dr. Schoenbeck is exactly right. We need that study, and we got their signature that they're going to initiate it. They're going to put the first 700,000 in, and it's going to be a multi-year study. We need that information, and it'll help us know.
Okay. Governor, does your health department have the expertise and the horsepower, and has the legislature given them the money to carry out the mandate that is now being put on their shoulders?
The persons that are at the top of this right now are very qualified, but they're not sufficient in number. We need to add more folks to help us do this job, and we talked about it today because we signed the agreement Friday. We're going to put in place the very best people we can hire to be sure that we get the right evidence and make the right analysis.
Okay, Jim Stone?
Jim? I don't believe we need any more studies. We've had all the studies we need. What we need to do is document whether or not they broke the law. If they did, they ought to be thrown in jail, and a new bunch ought to be put out there that does it right. And then that bunch ought to be monitored and remonitored. And some of those signals ought to go into the governor's office so that he knows when there's a criticality.
And you believe that plant can be run safely?
Absolutely.
And in fact, you are for the production of nuclear weapons, are you not?
We have to do something about the nuclear industry. It's not going to go away. This is only the beginning of it. Whether weaponry stays or not, we've got to finish this industry and develop it into a viable industry for this area. I think we can do it.
Ms. Schroeder?
But we can't do it with those people we have out there.
Pat Schroeder?
Well, my feeling is, first of all, I agree that the studies are kind of academic. I was a good friend of Dr. Johnson's, and we've had lots of studies, and we know there's been problems. I think when we see that there's been some pollution, we've got to put the money first and foremost in cleanup. That is very, very critical. And secondly, if the plant continues to operate, make sure that it's someone we can trust and that this never happens again. So I think those are a twofold top priority, and then if they want to do academic studies, fine. But we know damage has been done. We know plutonium is harmful, and the only question is to what degree, and forget that. Clean it up. Spend the money on that first.
Okay, Pat Schroeder, thank you very much. We'll join you in just a minute, but first we'll take this break, and we'll look at some individual faces out at Rocky Flats right after this. In the broader sense, what remains unanswered throughout all this is the matter of Rocky Flats' accountability to us, the public, and what is being done to try and make this nuclear weapons facility more responsible to the community in which it makes its home.
This kind of preposterous rewarding of the fox and guarding the chicken house, that's what we've seen out there.
This picture of the fox guarding the chicken house is one that's been painted of Rocky Flats time and time again. Despite the attention given this latest scandal, many are skeptical about promises to keep an eye on the chicken house.
It's going to blow over, like everything else blows over. Nothing's going to happen. Roma says that he'll do everything short of closing the place, which means he's going to do nothing.
Am I surprised that the government has trouble doing things? Nah, not really.
Last year, Congress passed legislation creating the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board. The goal? Bring accountability and oversight to Rocky Flats and other nuclear weapons plants. President Bush had until March 21st to appoint 5 members to that board. The deadline has passed, and the oversight plan still exists, only on paper. Inaction, it seems, is a hallmark of efforts to make Rocky Flats more accountable.
For the last 15 years, we've been working to attempt to have independent audits of Rocky Flats, to look at Rocky Flats. It is very clear from the records of this investigation and from other evidence now that we've been lied to year after year after year.
And the events of the past 2 weeks have jolted lawmakers into yet another round of action to try and bring accountability to Rocky Flats.
I've asked the Department of Energy to conduct an immediate review of the management of that.
I am
announcing today a program of 10 steps, 10 items of action that I believe are...
And that's why I asked the Judiciary Committee to get into this and find out why one government agency, the Department of Energy, would be giving...
We've tried just a whole variety of ways to make Rocky Flats and DOE facilities overall more accountable to the public. That has been resisted by DOE, we've been resisted by the Department of Justice, been resisted by the administration.
While past attempts have failed to bring accountability and oversight to an operation that some say answers to no one, there is now hope that there is enough pressure from enough sources that at long last the fox will be relieved of guard duty at the chicken house.
We really need to put the heat on Romer and the agencies and the congressional delegation to pass laws so that this cannot happen again.
Certainly the rhetoric that the new Secretary of Energy, Admiral Watkins, has been giving indicates that he is more sensitive, or that he wants the Department of Energy to be more sensitive to environmental, public health, and safety concerns. Now that rhetoric will be put to the test.
And before we go on, we just want to say that 7 News at 10 o'clock will be delayed a few minutes while we end our program here. Let's go back to Pat Schroeder in Chicago, and we heard from numerous politicians who represent all of us here in the state of Colorado. What can you do now in Congress to wrap this whole thing up?
How do you make him accountable?
Oh, we've done several things already that we have put in the Defense Authorization Bill, which authorizes all the nuclear weapons area. And that is saying that employees should be hired from Rocky Flats if they decide to close it down because they're knowledgeable and they should proceed. We're dealing on the bonuses, that there can be no more bonuses in the future based on production alone. That's very important. And finally, I would like to see in that bill, which we will deal with in conclusion at the end of the summer, in there of things saying Rocky Flats must comply with the agreement or they don't get their funds to operate. That's how you get them. You go right at their money and you say either you do A, B, C, and D, or you close. And I don't think they understand anything else. Otherwise, every time you catch them with their hand in the cookie jar, they get 14 reasons as to why they'll never do it again. And you're going to find them with a hand in the cookie jar again. So if we say, if you don't do the following things, guess what? You lose your money, you lose your contract. I think it's the only thing they understand.
Governor Roy Romer, how
agree?
do you make him accountable?
Well, I intend to make them accountable by our establishing in Colorado absolutely independently verifiable answers to the question of water quality and air quality and waste management. I think we have an obligation to the citizens of this state to say that we can solve this problem. You know, it's one thing to criticize, it's another to find a solution, and I am dedicated that we're going to find a solution that is not dependent on anybody's word, but we can verify it. And I think it can be done. I think this agreement we wrote on Friday is the beginning of it, and the proof will be in the pudding. But I got to tell you, we need to get the truth on the table, and we don't need to deal with innuendo and rumor, and I would like to get there as soon as possible.
Okay, Governor Romer, thank you very much. And we will be back in just a minute to talk about the future of Rocky Flats. Can it survive? Should it survive? Right after this. You know, you have people working out there. Rocky Flats workers and their families are split over the benefits versus the risks of working at a nuclear weapons plant. The jobs generally pay well, but some say the cost has been just too high. Von Roche has more on that.
Kurt Bowman bought his house in North Glen and raised 2 children on his earnings as a Rocky Flats worker, retiring 6 months ago. He didn't consider the job dangerous, at least not any more than traveling or watching TV.
My health is threatened any time I drive down the highway or any time I get on an airplane. Any television monitor puts out a certain amount of radiation.
More than you're likely to pick up at Rocky Flats?
Probably.
Despite an FBI investigation of alleged unsafe practices at Rocky Flats, Bowman sees the controversy as mere sensation, concocted by reporters.
I just kind of chuckled.
Why?
Some of it I think is a big joke.
Why so?
The TV and newspaper needed something to write about.
One day our lives were normal, and the next day they were completely turned upside down.
Kay Williams views the controversy differently and with good reason. In 1981, her then husband, Don Gables, died of brain cancer. He had worked at Rocky Flats for 9 years.
But it's something that, you, like I said, you don't want to acknowledge. And
Why not?
because it's too scary. You are locked in to a certain pay, certain benefits, and so it's easier to believe it's not really there, that it's easier to take the rationale that we are safe.
Do you think that's what a lot of workers at Rocky Flats do?
I'm sure they do. And then they see someone like Don, and it's like, well, that won't happen to me. That just happens to the other guy.
Don Gables was that other guy, often considering quitting his job, but dissuaded by the need to feed and house a wife and 3 children.
You work there so long, they train you to work there. By the time you start getting concerned and thinking maybe I should be working somewhere else, you can't afford to.
Williams believes Rocky Flats officials had a moral obligation to tell her husband of the danger, but instead lied.
If people want to work out there, they need to have all the facts to make that decision. Kind of like a cigarette wrapper, warning danger to your health.
But Kurt Bowman insists again that there was no unreasonable danger, and he defends the secrecy surrounding Rocky Flats.
Out there, we know what we need to know. That's the philosophy of the whole plant and the philosophy of the national defense, is need to know.
There's one downside of this investigation, Ernie. It's best expressed by a telephone call I got from a tearful woman who works out at Rocky Flats the other day. She said now people are starting to think of the people as who work at Rocky Flats the same way they did in the latter part of the Vietnam War about the soldiers who were coming back from Vietnam. So the downside of this is a lot of people who work hard out there and take pride in their work are being blamed for something that obviously came from the top.
Sure, exactly.
Let's open it up now. Governor Romer, what's the most important thing you would tell the people of Colorado about Rocky Flats and about your agreement with the federal government?
And about its future.
Okay. First, I think the policy we need to have is you run it safe and you run it clean or you close it down. That's our policy. Now, to make that work, we need to put in place monitoring that is independent, it can't be tampered with, where we don't really need to rely upon anybody's truthfulness, but we verify it, to test the quality of the water, the quality of the air, the way they handle the waste, and also the question of criticality. And I think some of us need to divide that responsibility up. The state of Colorado has that responsibility in air and water and on waste. The federal government does on criticality. I think that this problem needs to be approached very, very diligently, and if we can't solve it, the plant ought to be closed.
Governor, I have one question. They built this thing in the early 50s, but it wouldn't have been built in the 60s, it wouldn't have been built in the 70s, it wouldn't have been built in the 80s. I guess my question is, where do you draw the line in the sand here?
Well, I don't want this plant to be rebuilt at this location. My position has been keep it there for its useful life. When it has to be rebuilt, relocate it. It ought not be in a metropolitan area. But it ought not last even a day if it is proven to be endangering to the citizens of this community, and we need to verify that and do it quickly.
And that's your line in the sand?
That's right.
Pat Schroeder?
Well, my line in the sand has been from day one. First of all, I didn't want them moving into the new, very expensive buildings they built and contaminate them, and they did, because it is in the wrong place. I think at the time they built it, they didn't know as much as they know now, but it's in the wrong place, and that's very, very sad. I think even the Department of Energy, as much as we've been trashing the Department of Energy, has admitted that and recognized that, and that's why they now have plans in the future to move it. So I think we ought to be talking to them about what are they going to do and how fast can they do that, and how do we get it cleaned up, and if there's any danger today, then it gets closed down now. I just don't think that the safety of Coloradans is anything that's negotiable. These nuclear triggers were to scare the Russians, not Coloradans. And I think because they played so fast and loose with the environment, they're scaring Coloradans, and I want that to end. I also want to say something about the people at the plant.
Okay.
The workers have worked very hard, and they've been shortchanged often by management, trying to get them to shortchange safety procedures and other such things. And so I hope people don't feel that way about workers at the plant, because they really are victims of management who've been much more interested in their bonuses than in their workers' safety and in Colorado's safety.
Okay, Dr. Schoenbach, your final thoughts, and where do you think we should draw the line in the sand?
Well, the bottom line in my mind is that Rocky Flats doesn't belong anywhere near Denver, and that no matter how safe the plant is, no matter how good an operation, you cannot guarantee that catastrophe won't happen. So I'm not satisfied with just making it safe and making it work better. I want it out of here as soon as possible. Now, the other thing is that when you get rid of it, you have to make sure that you clean it up. And what I would say is use the adage that came from Watergate: watch where the money goes. We do not have enough. We don't have money for cleanup right now.
Now, is that realistic, though?
What's that?
Is that realistic?
To clean it up?
Yeah.
Oh, we better clean it up, otherwise we'll have a national sacrifice zone here. I mean, it has to be cleaned up.
Why not get rid of it now?
What's that?
Why not get rid of it now?
Well, it's not so easy to shut down the plant immediately. It's a long process, but I would like to start it now. I would also say, I follow up with Pat Schroeder's comment, is that to pay attention and to listen to the workers. The workers are the ones who know how to clean that plant up, because they know the insides of that building. And that I would love to see legislation which would guarantee that the workers will continue on in their jobs with their salaries when they go through that transition from production nuclear weapons to clean up of Rocky Flats. I think that's very important, and that we can do that in this society legislatively.
Okay. Jim Stone is a man who made a lot of allegations, and they are just allegations because of the investigation. What are your final thoughts on Rocky Flats?
I think we should not lose sight of the investigation out there. That was instigated not because of my suit, but because the FBI thought that the RCRA laws had been violated. That should be completed. And I agree that Pat Schroeder's idea of giving immunity to those people that can come forth with constructive criticism. Governor Romer should join in that effort to get that work done, so we can clean that up immediately.
Governor Romer, you're the man in the middle, and I see that you want to have a last word. Executive privilege.
No, not last word. I just want to say something about the workers. They really are the heroes of this story, because they've been doing some really good work. You know, I view them as very loyal citizens and very productive citizens, and they have been unfortunately dragged through a lot of suffering in this, and I just say, hey, we're feeling for them, and we ought to reaffirm the important contribution they've made.
Governor Romer, one more question. I think this needs asked. There seems to be an underlining tone in your voice that perhaps we have overblown the problems out there, particularly the immediate dangers. Tell us how we should perceive this place.
No, I don't think that we've overblown the question of finding out what's happened. We need to know the truth. What concerned me was some portions of this program that aimed at the question of criticality. And I think that some of that material is the first time I have heard it. I intend to check it out. I simply want to have the citizens of this community to have the most accurate and the most balanced view of possible on safety. And I just think that they deserve that, and we'll try to get it to them.
Okay, thank you all very much for joining us live
you.
tonight. We appreciate your comments and your information. Thank you all very much. And we will be back to wrap this thing up with some final thoughts right after this. For nearly 40 years, the Rocky Flats plant has perched upwind and uphill to the northwest of the Denver metropolitan area. Day in and day out, we paid little attention to that plant or what it does. Our knowledge of Rocky Flats has been gained during periods of intense scrutiny, usually after some major calamity like the disastrous 1969 fire. We have acquired bits and pieces of information from the allegations in the FBI affidavit. We may never know enough to take the edge off some of the current apprehension. Rocky Flats now sits center stage in this nuclear industry. It is being investigated by uncounted government agencies. So I suppose we can take some comfort in the fact the government now seems to be paying more attention to what the government is doing. I'm Ernie Bjorkman. Good night.